Recently, I've been working on a project to watch every slasher film ever made, chronologically. With that in mind, I decided it would be fun to rank them, highlight some lesser-known gems, and raise awareness that the genre is not simply blood and guts. For today, we'll go over the top 1960s slashers, as that's arguably when the genre originated. Of course, there are only about a dozen of the subgenre in total in that decade, so this is more looking at where it came from, rather than explicit ranking. We'll start with number 10, Twisted Nerve. The most well-known thing about this film has little to do with the plot or characters. It's the theme tune, which is also featured in Kill Bill and several seasons of American Horror Story. It's certainly memorable, and avoids some of the more controversial aspects of the film, namely the focus on a character pretending to have Down syndrome, or as it was called at the time, Mongolism. While the killer does not have it, he fakes the syndrome and associates his violent acts with it, thus drawing the comparison. However, looking at older films through a modern lens often paints them in a too harsh light, and here it changes from abominable to merely questionable. The structure of the film is similar to many of the decade, with the killer as the protagonist, trying to determine his motivations. Unlike many slashers of the 70s and 80s, there was little random violence, and they had a closer relationship with murder mysteries, with a clear link between the victim and the actions against them. The actual killing starts fairly late in the film, at 50 minutes, although it's relatively brutal for the standards of the time. The killer seems inspired by Alex from the novel A Clockwork Orange, which would be adapted a few years later into Kubrick's film. In terms of the quality of the filmmaking itself, it's serviceable, although the pace is often slow, and outside of the protagonist, the characters are fairly underdeveloped. Next is Dementia 13, Francis Ford Coppola's first film. It was intended to be a quick cash grab after the success of Psycho, invoking many of the same themes, but with a higher body count and more gothic atmosphere. Through a quirk in how it was copyrighted, the film is in the public domain, and as such can be viewed just about anywhere, although a director's cut was released in 2017 with added commentary. The atmosphere and location are certainly what set it apart, and a medieval castle is a fantastic location for a bloodbath. But it's apparent that it's Coppola's freshman effort, lacking much of the dynamism or interesting themes that would pop up in his later work. It does feature several tropes that would become common in future slashers, with the main motivation behind the killers due to sins of the past, an incident prior to the beginning of the film which drives the plot, as well as featuring an Ahab, an authority figure with a previously established relationship with the killer who ultimately attempts to stop them. Part of the issues with production came from the clash between Roger Corman, a prolific producer, and Coppola. Corman wanted more blood and violence, whereas Coppola wanted more focus on mystery and intrigue. In the end, neither got the desired result, and the film is unfortunately mediocre despite a few standout elements. The House That Screamed is a Spanish film, and a period piece, depicting a girl's home from the late 19th century. Again, the location and atmosphere do the heavy lifting, with the plot being relatively threadbare, and the direction and cinematography being pedestrian. It's a film clearly inspired by gothic horror, but updating it with modern ideas and structure, with clear notes of Psycho and the Murder Clinic. In turn, it would become a large influence on both Suspiria and Pieces. It's also interesting that while the film is a mystery, the first and most obvious suspect turns out to be the culprit, and somewhat a subversion of expectations. The film would become a huge success in its home country, becoming the top-grossing domestic film of all time, or for a few years at least. Violent Midnight takes the number 7 spot here, and like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre a decade later, it's more notable for what it doesn't show than what it does. While less violent than some of its contemporaries, careful editing and arrangement of shots allow it to feel more gritty and bloody than it actually was. It's also notable for how taboo its subject matter is. It openly discussed sex and incest, and while the actions were not shown on screen, it had only been 3 years since the toilet was in a major motion picture, so even alluding to them was quite the scandal. Spoilers for a 50-year-old film, but the killer is also revealed to be the sister of the protagonist, killing out of misguided love for him. This means it was the first film with a female killer, which still only make up about 5% of slasher villains. Color Me Blood Red is the third in Herschel Gordon Lewis's Blood trilogy, although the second, 2000 Maniacs, is not a slasher. The subject matter here is the one that has reoccurred a few times throughout the decades, with an artist who is having difficulty with their next projects, and ends up committing terrible acts of violence for inspiration, materials, or simply out of frustration. Here specifically is the titular blood that becomes his paint and creates masterpieces. Lewis is known for gratuitous violence in his films, but this one is relatively restrained. While there is theoretically multiple canvases worth of gore, the effect is muted given the subject matter. Despite this, there is a compelling killer, a few interesting deaths, and a fairly exciting finale. Blood and Black Lace is the representative of giallo film, a subcategory of Italian horror that first became popular in the 70s and early 80s, although there are a few examples, like this one, before then. They share certain aesthetic elements like a mystery killer wearing black leather gloves, intense colors, and discordant soundtracks. The plots often have a heavy focus on police, and mostly feature violence towards women. All of these are present here, although the film would be relatively financially and critically unsuccessful, and it took more than half a decade for the genre to take off with The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. The plot involves several murders at a fashion house, where they manufacture upscale clothing. There's a heavy focus on the mystery of who is behind them, and a motive is revealed early on with a mysterious diary containing revelations that are doled out throughout. Again, spoilers, but this film is also relatively unique in having two killers working together, something that is still uncommon in slashers outside of the Scream franchise. Like many of its ilk, there was a focus on the settings, atmosphere, and emotions, rather than a tightly woven plot or memorable characters. Here it largely works, and because of this it can be watched entirely without subtitles or dubbing, and still be fairly entertaining. Blood Feast is the example of a splatter flick, one focused entirely on blood and gore. Lewis, its director, believed that Psycho had cheated the audience out of seeing the actual violence and puts it on full display, including an opening less than 2 minutes into the film featuring a naked woman in a bathroom who is then murdered by a knife-wielding maniac who also dismembers her corpse. The message is as unsubtle as a sledgehammer, but it also sets the tone immediately for what kind of film it is. It kills every 10 minutes or so for its 67-minute runtime, plenty of ridiculous gore effects, and little room for anything else. The motivation of the killer is notable in that it's not necessarily a mental illness or revenge. Instead, he's devoted to an ancient Egyptian god, Ishtar. Of course, she was actually a Mesopotamian deity, and her closest equivalent in Egypt was Isis, but research was not a priority for the film. There's no indication that his ritual to resurrect her would work, as the 60s had no supernatural elements in their slashers, just plain old humans stabbing people. The film is also notable for being filmed in 4 days, with a budget of about $250,000, adjusted for inflation. With all that in mind, it's not a particularly good film, but is incredibly entertaining and well made given all the restrictions. Berserk, for which the exclamation point must always be pronounced, is a British film that, unlike many of the previously mentioned titles, is actually focused on characters and the script. It's got a unique setting, a traveling circus, and has a great lead in Joan Crawford in her second-to-last performance. She was one of the most well-known movie stars during the late 20s and 30s, but after a string of failures became box office poison and began to be more selective with her work. She plays the domineering ring mistress and has to work hard to keep her performance in line, as well as prevent the circus from shutting down. The kills themselves are tied to the circus acts, including knife throwing, failed illusions, and high wire falls. Unfortunately, they didn't have the budget to involve the animals in any of the carnage, although there are a few scenes of them performing typical tricks. The final twist is set up well, and is fairly emotional with a great performance by Crawford. While as mentioned previously, the atmosphere is not as heavy or entertaining as some others, the environment does lend itself to interesting scenes, and there's more movement in the camera than other films of the era, making it feel more like a modern production. There's nothing lacking in it, it just can't quite compare to the next two entries. This may be controversial, but Psycho is simply very good. Compared to other thrillers at the time, it's certainly great, but looking at it with a modern eye, the effects really let things down, with special focus on the scene where the detective is pushed down the stairs. It's understandable why it was filmed that way, but it does detract from the overall emotions of the film. Similarly, while killing off Marion Crane halfway through the film is unexpected, and the sequence is of course masterful, we swap to the much less interesting character of her sister in The Private Eye. We also spend more time with Norman Bates, which is good, but he can't carry the film on his shoulders, much as he tries. It's impossible to say anything about the film that hasn't already been said, so I'll leave it there, and try to explain why the number one film is better. Peeping Tom is the first slasher, and still among the best. It focuses on the titular voyeur, Mark, a focus puller on a film set who makes snuff films of his victims. It is much more in common with later films like May, Pearl, or Maniac than it does with its contemporaries, or the glut of Halloween and Friday-inspired affairs. While by the end of the film we don't understand Mark, we pity him, and can at least see elements of how he became who he was. The film also has a meta element, as it examines the role that movies have on their creators and stars, as well as the quest for perfection, which ultimately leads to Mark's demise. It also offers commentary about the role of the audience in a horror picture, frequently using point-of-view shots to make them complicit with the actions on screen. The first kill of the film occurs very early on, is entirely in first person. Mark picks up a prostitute, then follows her to an apartment, passing by a disapproving bystander on the way. As she begins to undress, Mark immediately steps forward and impales her with a spike on the end of his camera stand, using a phallic weapon as a substitute for sex, which would go on to become one of the most common tropes in slashers. Very little of violence is shown on screen, with no blood, and cutaways to avoid the gruesomeness, but it uses the viewer's imagination to fill in the gaps. Interestingly, this kill is shown later on in more detail, as Mark watches back his snuff films in the presence of a blind woman, a trope that will be used in several other horror films, the most well-known being Manhunter. This also continues the meta elements, as we as the viewers are blind to the efforts that went into making the films like this one, the blood, the sweat, and the tears. Carl Bohm's performance as Mark is equally as electrifying as Perkins' Norman Bates, but he has much more screen time, and we get to see the various masks he puts on and sheds. This is especially true when he interacts with Ellen, the blind woman, as his voice tells a completely different story from his actions and his face, embracing the theatrical two faces. It also avoids the explanation scene that brings down Psycho's ending, allowing the viewer to interpret the motivations rather than telling them. One of the modern interpretations of the film is that it was a criticism of sexual repression in Britain, that the constant pursuit of approval from a patriarchal figure could be compared to the country's devotion to the monarchy, and the voyeuristic nature of the film was a commentary on the obsession with their celebrity, not merely adhering to them as the ultimate authority, but desiring to know them. This, of course, became an even greater issue in the future decades, with Princess Diana being the ultimate expression of it. This list is not objective in any way, it's simply my personal rankings. If you have different views, or are hearing about some of these films for the first time, please let me know. Thank you for watching, and be well.